Just going to introduce myself very quickly. David Rattray. I'm the editor of the East Hampton Star and the founder of the Plain Sight Project, which is trying to identify and name every person of color and enslaved individual living on the east end of Long Island since about 1650 up to maybe about the Civil War. And recently we've got a little uptake in a group maybe starting on the North Fork in Southold, and we're just beginning to get into Southampton. And we started with 2 enslaved people that we knew of, 2 names, and we're up to over 300 now. So we're on our way, but there's a lot of work to do.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Donna Marie Barnes, and I'm the curator and archivist at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm on Shelter Island. And I'm also a partner with David in the Plain Sight Project. And part of my job is to uncover the names and hopefully the lives of the enslaved and indigenous people of Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island. We're going to talk a little bit more about our project and the work that we do individually, but I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Colvin, the author of Africaville.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. And also thanks very much to the staff, Jesse and the other people here at the staff at the Arts Center. It's been a wonderful experience so far, so I look forward to doing more. I want to talk a little bit about the novel, those of you who have not had a chance to read it yet. I'm often asked when people hear about the novel, how did a young man from Alabama come to write a novel about Canada? The short answer is I'm from Alabama, and I was writing a series of short stories in the 90s about these small communities along the Selma to Montgomery March. This is the march many of you know, was taken by Dr. King and other marchers. And we know about a lot of the leaders of that march, but not a lot about the people who were along those communities. And so my grandmother's actually raised a family in a rural community in Alabama, so I have some experience with that. And I began writing these stories, and by the time I got to the 80s, a lot of these towns were gone. The towns were no longer there. And then about 2000, I saw an article in the New York Times about this village on the edge of Halifax, Nova Scotia, called Africaville. And it had been in the news in the 60s when, over the objection of the residents, the city of Halifax went in and forced everyone out of their homes and razed all of the houses. And so the 2001 article, though, was about the way in which the community was continuing the information about that town, keeping the history alive. That was one of the reasons why I was very interested in hearing about the project happening here. But and I began to write about that community, and I began to do research. And one of the questions I had was, how did the people get there? And so in pulling together the village of Halifax, of Africaville, I used basically 3 sources. One was war. During the Revolutionary War, blacks, both freed and enslaved, came up to Canada with whites and settled mostly in Quebec and Ontario, but also in Halifax. And during the War of 1812, the British were trying to get blacks to leave the plantation and join the so-called resistance. And a lot of blacks took them up on that. And so it turns out the War of 1812 resulted in the largest manumission of blacks prior to the Civil War. And so these became the first inhabitants of my mythical town of Africaville, this idea of war. And then the second group were the Underground Railroad. And many of you know that about 100,000 blacks went to north during the 19th century, and about, I would say, a quarter of them went on to Canada. And some of these blacks wound up in Halifax. So they became the sort of the second group that formed the community of Africaville. Then the third group was from the Caribbean. There were a group of Jamaicans called the Trelawney Jamaicans who lived in the highlands of Jamaica, and they had a number of, they had left the plantations and had a few skirmishes with the British, and actually had a few treaties with them as well. But there were a group that were accused of fomenting unrest, rounded up and shipped out to Halifax. And so they wound up in Halifax around 1790s. So from this group, I began to pull together these people who were to become the residents of my Africaville. And the story itself, though, is about 3 generations of the Seaboat family. The first generation was spawned from both the Jamaicans and the Southern blacks. And so then the second generation moved down to Vermont, and then the final generation wound up in Alabama. So that sort of, in some ways, that sort of rounded the story out. Even though I am from Alabama, my story is about a black community that existed both in the South and in Halifax, and then eventually returned to their roots in Alabama. So I look forward to there's information about the novel, as you can see as you go around reading the text around for the installation, but I'm more than happy to answer additional questions about it as well.
One of the things that Donna Marie and I were talking about the novel is you started writing it 20 years ago, and what I sort of wonder your intentions for the work in the year 2000 or 2001 and your intentions for the work now or as you were finishing it and how that changed as the world changed.
Well, the original intent was to really investigate these lost communities. I was very interested in them, and I began to discover them in a lot of places. Canada, for example, if you look at really across Canada, there are a number of these communities that existed in Canada, but we all know about them also, thanks to the work that you're doing, in the United States as well. So the initial impetus really was this idea of lost communities. And it turns out, you know how you sort of start things, you're really angry about that. Well, you know, communities do change. And so some of it is a historical, you know, not all of it can be attributed to, you know, nefarious efforts by whites. But at the same time, though, there are some communities in which racism did play a part in the community's destruction. That was the case in Africaville. But I looked at a number of different communities, and I noticed that it was happening really all over the world. There were a lot of communities that sort of came and went. So my initial sort of strong feelings about it, I had to cool that down so that I could write the novel, because, you know, the novel really has to show the various sides of people and also the various sides of the community. And so the initial impetus was this idea of lost communities. By the time the novel finally got published, 20 years later, I still felt that a lot of the issues in the novel were relevant to what was happening in the community today. Now, it's interesting, though, that people didn't start inviting me to talk about that until the Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd. I mean, these things happened. Then all of a sudden, people say, well, what in your novel speaks to that? Yes. And it's very interesting. I mean, I won't go into all of that. You can sort of, that's really what the exhibit is about, trying to get the information out about why the novel is relevant and what parts of it might be useful to people who want to look at ways in which a community existed in a racist society. And so I think the novel looks at, for example, police brutality. I mean, it's one of the items here, as well as various other ones that you can see as you go around and see the exhibit.
Right. Well, I think that mentioning this summer particularly, the things that have happened, the marches, George Floyd's murder, have brought the work that we're doing to more of the public eye. There is more interest. Perhaps it's also due to the pandemic because we're at home and we have more time and more mental capacity to take things in. But this has been a very busy summer. As David mentioned, we were here 2 weeks ago, and as I was telling him a little while ago, I feel like I haven't stopped talking. And it's all really wonderful conversations because I think that the public, all of you that are here today, you're thirsty, you're hungry for this knowledge, and because the stories are so rich and because the history is so immediate and it's so important to where we live today and will instruct us and help us in how we move forward. And so I think with your novel, too, of this community, it does kind of echo several communities that we have right here on the East End, from Freetown in East Hampton to Eastville in Sag Harbor, and other communities, Weeksville in Brooklyn, where free people of color lived, and to the Sands community in Sag Harbor, which was established after World War II. And we're just getting historical designation now. All of these pieces of this history, again, we've said this often, is part of the history of place. It's not a specific history of black people. It's the history of all of us. It's the history of the communities that we all live in. It's American history. And the novel that you've written connects not only American history, but Canadian history, North American history of how this experience is all relevant to all of us.
You know, Jeffrey, one of the things that really struck me, you know, there's a chapter called, I think it's As Black as I Want to Be. And then there's a chapter called Crowing. And Crowing in particular, for those of you who haven't read the book, do you want to, you know, is that a spoiler if we talk about that chapter?
No, not at all.
I mean, to me, it's a pivotal chapter in the book, sort of a fulcrum around which a lot of the different storylines wrap, you know?
Well, this really gets at Donna's issue when you were talking about how it really is an issue that affects all of us. Crowing in the novel refers to when someone, any person, puts out an image of themselves or their identity that's different from their actual identity. And in the novel, the story is of a Canadian politician who was running for public office in the 30s. And he was running as a Canadian, saying that his parents had been born in Canada. It turns out the parents had been born in Germany. And so, you know, after the war, the Canadians were not too happy with the Germans after World War I. And so as a result, he wound up losing the election. And so the novel, even though in the novel, the second generation of the Seaboat family Etienne decides to pass for white. The novel really is about the way in which, what I was really looking at in the novel is really the way in which we identify ourselves and present ourselves to the world. This might be, for example, when I came north from Alabama, I mean, one of the things what you do is people identify you based on your accent. And they treat you in certain ways because of your accent. Same thing is true with teenagers when they join certain groups. You know, we hide certain parts of ourselves and we present certain parts of ourselves. So the novel is really about the way in which we present ourselves to the world, and also what happens to us internally when we have some issues with how we present ourselves into the world. For example, Etienne passes for white, but there's an internal struggle that happens with him. That is one of the things that we can explore in fiction, because we can get into the interior of the character. So really, the second generation is really about passing, or crowing, as it's called in the novel, and the internal struggles that ensues. Now, the third generation, Warner, finds out he has a black grandmother when he is an adult. And then his struggle is really external. He tries to get back to the community of Africaville, and then Africaville. But then, of course, because his father has been passing, they want no thing to do with him, and so he has to, find a way to get back to his own roots. So those are the two things. This idea of identity that exists for really all of us. It isn't just blacks who make certain decisions. We all make decisions about how we're going to present ourselves, to what we wear and how we speak, and that's really what I was after in the novel.
Donna Marie, you pointed out as we were talking about the physical objects.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Right.
So
About there's the box and
right. So in the
right.
book, there are objects that the characters identify with that are sort of connectors. Generationally, the memento box, the bracelets, the bone. What place did you do that really consciously about having objects be connectors of generations or signifiers of some other higher importance to these characters?
That is an interesting question. I was asked a similar question to that when I spoke at the Toronto Public Library about objects. And the short answer is yes. One of the things that objects, I think, do, they are holders of history. And so in my novel, the way in which objects come down and are passed down are very important. There was a jewelry bracelet, for example, that Zira gives to her son, Omar, before sending him up to Canada. She tells him, give it to the woman you're going to marry. And she had been given it herself by her mother died in childbirth, and she had been given this bracelet, and so she's passing it on to her son. So, and then the memory box from Cathella. And so these kinds of things, I think, are the ways in which we pass on stories. And since Africaville really is about, the way in which these three generations tell their stories, I found that objects was one way to connect the generations.
Yes. So for David and I, in the work that we do, we very rarely have objects. we have names on lists of either in wills or in account books, with the signifier in an account being purchases of shoes or pieces of clothing. And from that, we have tried to imagine these people that it connects to and what their lives may have been, and in this same sense of place. So we would love to have some objects.
Well, I think also for you, geographic places, the bluff, the cemetery in particular. I mean, it seems to me that the sense of place is very powerful. Even when Etienne and his wife are looking in a essentially a white community to buy a house. So geography, it really fascinates me too. The reverse geography of your novel as well. I mean, it seems to play a very big part in this story.
Well, that's true, and I delivered the novel to my I had two editors, one in Alabama and also the editor in Canada. It was bought by both HarperCollins USA and HarperCollins Canada, and so I wound up working with two editors. The editors in Canada were much more interested in the fact-checking. In fact, they sent it off to a historian. So I had to go through a whole long process of talking about that, which items in the book were to be seen as historically true, and which items in the book were to be seen as made up. And that was a tug of war a little bit with the but in the U.S., they were much more willing to allow me more leeway in terms of the geography. But in Canada, I mean, if the Canso Strait was 3 miles long, you better say it was 3 miles long, otherwise you get a note about that. So that was quite a process. I'm not, irritated about that, but so there was a lot. Yes, I just thought I'd mention that. But place was very important, and one of the things that the novel really is about is the novel. The opening line of the novel is newborns, and so it really is about the birth, growth, maturity, death, and in some sense the transcendence of Africaville. So over the course of the novel, the town grows, it expands, and then begins to contract. But because of the fight that the community is doing to keep the memory alive, in my opinion, the town does live on. So there are these places that continue to exist, if only in the stories told by the. Now, it's wonderful to see that you are documenting things, and they're trying to do as much in Halifax as well. But a lot of what we know about our past really is what our parents. It doesn't have to be parents, neighbors, people who knew. You run into someone who knew your parents or whatever. So we can also get these stories from other people as well. So that to me is also the way people find out about sort of where they're from. Right. Both the people and the places.
Right. But often that's a very selective process, and in the novel, people are very selective about what story about their past they tell, in terms of race in particular. I think in this community we've seen, and we've just sort of run into this where, people think of this community as sort of a farming, fishing, rugged community of hardscrabble farmers, and it turns out that it was very much involved in the Atlantic sugar and slavery industries, essentially, and this wasn't an economic backwater. And I think in some ways that the Africaville story fits into that as well, because drawing on people from the south of the United States, from the Caribbean, in some ways it feels almost like an answer to one of the questions that we're faced with a lot, which is where did people go? Right. And it may be that we need fiction to sort of answer that question. That may be one of the hardest questions of all for us to answer.
Yes. So we have often this question of, after emancipation or after an individual was manumitted, where did they go? And because the records we haven't found yet, because this is a very, time-consuming kind of labor to trace people, we haven't found exactly yet. But what we do know is that after slavery was abolished here, or enslaved people were manumitted, some of the men did choose to go to sea to be whalers. Some of the women then entered domestic service. But by and large, the communities dispersed. And that question of to where is one that we are
I
sort
think
of grappling
Africaville
with.
sort of, for me, in some ways, is a stand-in answer. And one of the paradoxes, of course, is when people cease being property, there are fewer records about them. And when they are property, there are lots of records about them, which is, it's a heck of a thing as a storyteller to, in a sense, not be able to tell the ending. And in a way, I think Africaville, the place, the idea, and moving forward from when the beginning is what, about 1912? 1918 to 92?
Yes.
1992. Can be read in a way, Donna Marie, maybe as kind of a, can we point people to that and say, here, I don't know where they went, but here, read this.
Read this.
I don't know.
We can,
Yeah.
and we probably will.
I mean, is that too much to sort of lay on your novel to say that we're going to use this for this missing piece of Black North American identity?
Well, one of the things I say about the book is that the novel really is a complement to stories about North America. There are a lot of them, and I do not think one novel really can answer the question of sort of blacks in North America. Having said that, though, the very last section of the novel is called "Who is North American?" And so, at the very end of the novel, you have this situation in which the Americans who came up from the South and the people who came from the Caribbean now have to discuss and talk about and wrestle with the idea of who owns the plot of land called Africaville. And so this idea of, who is North American? Who gets to, where are the Caribbean is North America, by the way. Yeah. And so, as we all know, and so is the South. Yeah. So, when you say immigrant, they're not really immigrating from North America. They're already here. But the idea of who owns a place. So I think the novel really is a complement to this idea of where people went. If you talk about North America, they didn't go anywhere. They just sort of moved around North America. Yeah. But within that, though, we did have some movement in terms of the South and the Caribbean and up to Canada.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the early movement in the novel is fact-based in that they were coming to work in coal mines.
Yes, there were, and it's interesting. In Canada, there was obviously a big coal mining industry and other kinds of mines. And blacks went as far north as Glass Bay, even further north than Halifax. So there were a lot of mines. And at the same time, there also were Europeans working in the mines as well. So you had there were several black communities in Canada just north of Halifax as well that I found during the research.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the things that is clear at places like this is there was no land available for anybody who wasn't one of the sort of original families. You could perhaps buy property here, but everything was sort of divvied up so that then the people who were more on the margins, and certainly people at the end of slavery or who are able to buy their freedom, becomes very difficult to find somewhere to go. And you're pushed, I guess, to a margin like Glass Bay or somewhere like that.
Yes. Well, we've talked about this before, but for my research, there were several people who had been enslaved at Sylvester Manor who were, in one instance, a woman named Matilda. I've told the story before. Matilda was given her freedom in 1795 for her loyalty to the family. But in her freedom, she was forced to borrow money from the enslavers in order to build a house on land that she had to rent from the family. So she had to pay back the debt as well as pay rent. And when she died, it did not pass to her descendants. It reverted back to the family. So again, it's this sense of displacement. In your freedom, you have still no power. She was not a landowner, although she is listed on a census as the head of household. The same was true for a man named Comus Fanning, who was able to, after his manumission, work and save enough money to buy 23 acres of prime land on Shelter Island. And he did pass it on to his stepdaughter, Julia, and she, little by little, was sort of swindled of the land by the family, by the Sylvester family and descendants, and they bought it all back from her for pennies on the dollar. And And again, she's a character that I thought about reading your book because she's somebody that I have a photograph of that was taken in 1884 for a magazine article about Sylvester Manor and Shelter Island, and the photograph is then engraved in this magazine, and the caption reads, "The last slave of Sylvester Manor," when in fact she was a freeborn biracial woman who worked as the housekeeper there for 40 years. So that was a little editorial license. But I have a lot of information about her, about where she lived, where she worked. She appears in census records. But her origins, for me, I know who her mother is, but I don't know who her father is. I don't know what ultimately happened to her. And not having those little key facts of her life, one, I have to do a lot of imagining. But it is frustrating because she is a major figure that I want to have be in a place of importance, but I'm still missing. But I always say I don't know yet because the search is not over.
Jeffrey, one of the things that strikes me as we're talking about place is how the characters in your novel do sort of disperse from quite early on. There's Kath Ella who grows up. Africaville is not called Africaville at that time. It's the hindquarter, I believe.
On the Woods Bluff,
right.
That section is called the hindquarter.
So this character, sort of at her first opportunity, ends up in Halifax and then Montreal. I forget but everybody seems to move in this story. Was that something that you was reflecting a reality that you saw in your research? Is that something you were writing? Because it really struck me is how people are absolutely moving all the time, and they're drawn back and they've got this core. But the idea of this constantly shifting family is really striking.
Well, the idea of the story, the spine of the story really asks the question, what forces would draw subsequent generations to cherishing the place they were born in, Africaville, and what societal forces would cause subsequent generations to drift away from Africaville. Now we know what forces would cause the subsequent generations to cherish Africaville. That is to say, the continued struggle and the fight by the residents to keep the memory alive. That's present throughout the novel. The idea of what would pull the society forces away from Africaville, for that, I hit on the idea of passing. That's when I was reading, what would cause a subsequent generation to estrange themselves from their community? And I sort of thought about it very hard. I came up with the idea of passing, and that's how I came up with the idea of Etienne.
Passing as white, that is.
Passing as white.
Make this,
and the idea of crowing. And so the idea of, and so with Etienne, he becomes estranged from Africaville, and then his subsequent generations, Warner, tries to get back to it. So really, that was the idea. That was, in exploring passing in the novel, I had to have it connected to the story of Africaville. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked. Right. And so it was used to tell the story of what societal forces pulls the generations away from the town.
Right. You also use education as a way that it pulls them away from their town. Cathella goes away to school. Etienne goes to work in a university in the South. And so those other societal forces take them away from that core, but also brings them back.
That's very true. And it's interesting because, I'm from Alabama, and most of my relatives, aside from my father's side, have all remained in Alabama. They've gone to school there, they've gone to college there. None of them, decided to leave, but I left to go. I haven't been back to live permanently since then. So I used some of my own experiences and thinking about my own ideas about what I remember about Alabama, the good and the bad, and the things that pulled me away from Alabama as well. So I sort of used my own personal experiences to talk about the way in which I became estranged from my own community. And so obviously I found places elsewhere, but,
I'm curious about your personal background and had you intended as a young man to become a writer? I certainly didn't, but sort of drifted into newspapering. But what was your trajectory?
I had no plans to become a writer. As a matter of fact, I Well, I shouldn't say that. In high school, I actually wrote plays in high school, but then I went off to the Naval Academy, and I wouldn't say that the arts were at the forefront of that place. And so I really did not, and then I joined the Marines, and so I was not at all writing out in the field or anything. One of the things I was doing, however, was reading a lot. And so one of the things that you find on military bases is a lot of public libraries, military libraries. And there are a lot of books that no one checks out. but they were, with nothing else to do, you sort of go through. So I was reading all these, sort of Renaissance literature. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of stuff. I sort of, since I had nothing else to read, I would read those things. So I did a lot of reading on military bases. When I got out of the military, I worked in Chicago at a big advertising agency called Leo Burnett. And I used to go to used bookstores, and that's when I learned about the muckrakers. So I read about, we all know about, sort of Upton Sinclair, The Jungle, the book about the meatpacking industry and how it led to changes in the Food and Drug Administration. But there were also, Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company that led to a way we look at monopolies. But there were all these people writing these progressive, books that were so interesting to me. And I think I sort of filed that back into my brain, in the back of my mind, after reading that. And then I worked on the Hill for a woman named Eleanor Holmes Norton, who ran for Congress. And I ran her, she had a district office in Anacostia, which was, quite a very interesting neighborhood to work in, because there were a lot of activists out there, but they had plenty to do out in that neighborhood. And so that's sort of where I began to think about communities and learn about communities and sort of think about different ways, really from the activists who were, in and around. Sure. They would call me up for certain things, and I we'd have, one time they came up with a bullhorn, we're going to storm our office, for example. And so, you get to hear about things in the community from working there. And so that's really how I sort of got interested in that and writing about those kind of things.
Well, we're going to take questions in just a second, but you said that writing Africaville took you 20 years. So are you writing a second?
Yes, I am working on a second novel. I don't plan to take 20 years on this one. Yes, this is also a historical novel. It's a novel that's set in French-occupied Mobile, Alabama. A lot of people don't know that Mobile was actually the French capital before New Orleans. It's the site of the first Mardi Gras. So the novel takes place in 19th century Mobile, and also French-occupied Vietnam. And so it's a alternative history novel as well. It looks at what would happen if slavery had not been abolished, and you had a situation in which people had to decide how to live their life and struggle under that regime. So it takes place, as I said, in Mobile, and also it's also at the core of it, the main character is a musician. So the novel is based on bringing in actual people who lived and using their actual stories.
It's a modest undertaking. Are there questions for Jeffrey Colvin about background, the novel? Anything pop to mind? That's such an interesting that phrase, breathe freely, is in Canada. I mean, is that right? It could a black citizen of the United States who ends up, or from the Caribbean, who ends up in Halifax, breathe freely?
Well, this is a very interesting story, and I think one of the ways, I started out by saying a young black man from Alabama writing a story about Canada. It really is not so odd, because a lot of the same issues that blacks are dealing with in the U.S., they were dealing with in Canada as well. I think that's one of the reasons why the story resonated with me so easily, being from the South, for example. And also the idea of people going from the South to Canada, as your relatives did, and then back again. I also found very interesting. Why did they go there? What did they discover when they got there? And then what drew them back to the U.S.?
We haven't talked about the character of Warner, who's fascinating because he returns. Well, he's living in Vermont, grows up, I guess, in Vermont, and then he ends up in Montgomery working to free his great-grandmother, who's serving a life sentence for a an act of rebellion when she was part of a group called the New Confederates. And that, I don't know how much of that is your imagination and how much of this is based on real life, but that relationship struck me as fascinating. This Vermonter returning to a place he didn't really know to try and get his great-grandmother out of prison. And of course, she doesn't believe he's family initially. I mean, I thought it's a really fascinating moment late in the book, a piece of the book. Yeah, I don't know what the question is, but I just thought that's not something I wanted to miss.
Well, I can tell you the impetus of that was I had read an article about the quick way in which justice was meted out to whites and blacks in the early part of the century. You could be accused of something, go into the judge, and be sentenced to life in 15 minutes. And I thought that's
yeah, you do it in about 2 paragraphs.
Yeah, I'm like, that's an odd way. And so this character Zira goes onto a houseboat, intending to throw paint on the boat of the governor, and a guard that was a guard in the boat slips and falls into the water and drowns. And so she and her husband are originally sentenced to be hanged, and then it was reverted to life in prison. But what's interesting about the story is that was in 1918 or so, and then she winds up, she's still there in 1992. And so by the time, after all those experiences, she has really doesn't feel right about getting out. Her husband died in prison, and then her son, well, I can't give away all of the novel. Things happen to her over the course of the novel that really, so by the time she gets to the 90s, it has changed her significantly. And so here comes this great-grandson claiming he's a relative and wanting to get her out of prison. This has happened before. There's a scene in which a young black reporter comes in and interviews her and totally writes a different article after the interview. She didn't even get to interview Zira, but when she gets done, she explains, I talked to her, and she said she wants to get out and all of this. And so she'd had a lot of hard times in that. And so she's a different person by the time her grandson arrives. And so that is the struggle between those two. He wants to find his identity, and she's not willing to help him do that. He wants to get back to Africaville. They're not willing to accept him. And so that really that's the last part of the book, his struggle.
Does anybody else have a question for Jeffrey or for David? Yes, but there's a
Trails.
Can you repeat the question?
Okay, Sarah, I think I know the question. It has to do with one of Zira's experiences in prison, in which she has a friend named Davida. And Davida has been placed in prison for killing an abusive husband who basically tried to kill her, and she got him first. And so, but she's in jail for that. And Davida and Zira become friends in prison. And then, having been in prison a long time, Zira finally starts to let her guard down and let this woman into her life. And there is a betrayal in the novel in which she finds out that she's been betrayed by Davida. And this is one of throughout the course of the novel, there are a number of incidents like this. But this is the one that really affects her the most, because she really, their friendship, it covers a number of pages in the novel. The way in which they didn't go to the same college, but they had gone to similar colleges, and they sort of, for a couple of years, not to graduate, and then they had those experiences. And they also had other experiences that they got very close. And so that was what I was trying to explore in that instance, was the way in which incarceration and the experiences you have shaped you as a person. And so that was building toward her experiences when she meets her son and her inability to trust at that point in her life. Well, I made several trips up to Canada, obviously. I did a lot of research up there. The only thing I can speak to really is some of the experiences I had talking to people in Canada. Obviously, I didn't live in Canada, so I can't say whether or not. Obviously, the novel itself grew out of what really was an egregious racial incident. The forcing people off their land and raising as a matter of fact, in 2010, the city of Halifax apologized and is making restitution to some of the people. And they're also paid money to, there's a museum in Halifax now called the Africaville Museum, in which some of the money is being used. So people can now go on the site and actually see the land, and also there are pictures of the town. And so, in looking at some of the videos I was looking at a long time ago about, the people could have been right out of my family album. I mean, I recognize those faces. Some of them were obviously from the Caribbean, but some of them were Southerners as well. But I didn't, and when I went up to visit, you know, I show up, I think it was, they had the Africaville community picnic, annual picnic, and I went up last year, and it was like going home. I mean, they welcomed me in, and so, but to answer that question, how many people know about, I'm sure you all do, the 1619 project from the New York Times? Well, the Canadian experience, 1600s, the first black on record is known to have arrived in Canada. He was a interpreter for one of the explorers. And also a young black boy from Madagascar is also on the record in the 1600s as being from Canada. And so people in Canada know that they have been around for a while. Blacks know that blacks have been there for a while. But I was surprised, quite frankly, at the number of Caribbean residents in all the major cities. That was, you know, I didn't know that. So that was interesting. I also didn't know that there were blacks in large numbers who had come up from the Oregon Territory. They'd come up to that part of Saskatchewan and also from San Francisco. The mayor of, I can't think of the town north of San Francisco. But up to Canada, they had been asked to come up and stayed there in the 1800s as well. And so all along the northern edge of Canada, there were black communities. But in every one of those communities, there are stories of difficulty with racial oppression. So, as I said, I don't know, I haven't lived in Canada, but there are plenty of stories that I was told through my research that would suggest that, you know, the problems are there as well.
Well, certainly the biggest incident of police brutality in the novel takes, I won't give it away, but it does take place in Canada.
Yes, yes. One of the things that I was looking at was the way in which the community was besieged. Obviously, in the opening of the novel, the 1918 flu pandemic was one of the things that sort of influenced the opening of my book. Now, my medical condition is a little bit different, but that was really the impetus for that. But there are a lot of things that the community sort of had to struggle with over the years. And in most cases, a lot of them were exacerbated by the lack of services and also downright racism from the wider community. So that was sort of one of the things I want to look at in the novel.
The very outset of the book starts with a pretty involved description of superstition about babies, and that struck me as well. I mean, so you almost feel like you're in the way, way, way back past, reading about the superstition that the moms have primarily.
Well, one of the things that happens when you're besieged by this is true of a lot of communities, when you're besieged by something like COVID, when people don't have an answer from the medical community, in some cases they go to people who might know. In the case of the people in Halifax, they asked the grandmothers, and the grandmothers, you know, gave them their idea about it. A lot of that was history, a lot of that was myth, and then, but at the same time, the mothers, there was also, I wanted to have an argument about it. I didn't want it to be seen as just this community that was dealing strictly with superstition. I mean, the mothers are skeptical. They said, well, how do we know this is true? You're telling us about the way in which we should handle this epidemic. And so I like the idea of communities not being a monolith. There are differences between generations, even in the opening of the book.
Yeah, that's a super important point, the lack of not being a monolith. That's something we encounter a lot, I think, and grapple with.
Oh, do you want to talk about your family?
Well, my family. But, you know, it's really interesting here. What I encountered when we first started working on it was a real kind of stiffening up by the traditional keepers of history. That was 3 years ago, and they were uptight about it. And I think it was kind of an moment where they realized that they were telling an incomplete story. And once they got over the shock of being called out, essentially, Because you can't argue with the lists. I mean, there's baptisms and deaths, and they're just lists. There's names. They began to accept it. Right now, we're experiencing the same thing on the North Fork that we experienced 3 years ago. One of the historical societies up there sort of won't touch us with a 10-foot pole. And I think it's the same reaction, which is like, oh, we aren't really telling a complete story. I don't know about Shelter Island, and then for you, I don't know.
Well, yes, we have a little bit of both on Shelter Island. But I know for me, so I grew up summers in Sag Harbor. I've always been a part of my life. I live in the Nineveh section of Sag Harbor. When I was introduced to the idea of Sylvester Manor through a book called The Manor, which I found quite by chance one day at work, I knew nothing about it. I knew nothing about the existence of enslaved people on the east end of Long Island. And once I started to uncover this history, it was literally mind-blowing. But also, in another way, it made so much more sense, and it made my sense of belonging so much deeper. Because the communities that I grew up in all of my life here in Sag Harbor Hills, Azure Rest, and Nineveh, and Chatfield Hills, and Eastville, these black communities, we all grew up here with a deep sense of we belong here. This is our place. And having now this connection to a deeper history, an older history, the history, is very empowering, and it's something that I want to celebrate. It's something I'm very excited about. Yes, some of the facts that we're learning, that these people were enslaved, that they had no freedom, that they lived under barbaric circumstances, whether or not it was as cruel or not as cruel as the South, some of those details it doesn't matter. They were not free. But they survived, and they were a part of this place, and they built this place to what it is now. And so all of us that are here that call the East End of Long Island home of some form or another, whether we're locals or second homeowners or transplanted homeowners now who are suddenly going to become locals, this is our history that we should all embrace. And I think at this point, there's no way to turn away from it anymore. This has to become the integral story and the very real story of how we began and what our connection was and is to the creation of this nation.
But in terms of reaction to your book, are you getting the that moment where people just go, "Oh, I didn't know this"?
Well, first of all, let me say I don't have much to add to that. That was very good. The reaction has been interesting in Canada, for example. I ran to a national legislator when I was out there for the picnic, and he seemed very interested in spreading the word about the book. I think in the United States, I think people are very interested when they find out the actual what the book is about. Blacks in Canada as a way into the story. And I think once they get into the story, some of the other issues began to emerge. But I think initially, the idea that it's a novel about this town that once existed in Halifax is what sort of gets people's interest.
Well, Jess, what do you say? Should we wrap it up and move to the next thing?
Thank you so much.